look at 4 astronomical discoveries and ask a few basic questions about what do we mean when we say somebody discovered something. I'm going to give you some examples of where it's not quite as clear as it could be. I've put the picture of Christopher Columbus simply because it seemed like an obvious one. And you can either take it that that's the cross he's holding or it's an early form of sextant or something. But you can see when Columbus got to America, he wasn't the first one there because there were people there already. There's even some dispute about whether he was the first one there anyway, the first European, I should say, because obviously there were people there already, but from a Eurocentric white man's point of view, as I was taught at school, Christopher Columbus discovered America 1492. It sounded like nobody was there before he went there. What I'm going to do, my father used to come out with this riddle when I was small, and I found it on the internet. What was the biggest island in the world before the discovery of Australia by Captain Cook? You probably know the answer already, but that sets the theme for what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk first, very briefly, about something that means something a lot to me, but it's not about astronomy, and I'm going to go straight in after that about astronomy. I'm diabetic, and I've been diabetic since 1969, and I've been on insulin since 1970. And insulin, as it says here, next year is the centenary year, discovery of insulin. When the Nobel Prize was awarded, it went to the guy on the left, Professor Frederick Banting, who's the guy here with the glasses, and Charles Best, who was the research student, the guy on the left. When the Nobel Prize was awarded, it didn't go to Banting and Best, it went to Frederick Banting and this other guy called John McLeod. Poor old Charles Best didn't get the Nobel Prize, but he did get a share of the prize money, and he did end his life full of academic honours. But it just illustrates when you say somebody discovered something, that very often the person who actually does the discovery gets passed over. You remember the last talk I gave, I talked about the discovery of Pluto in 1930. That's a newspaper article, just to remind you of my last talk. It's interesting, by the way, if you look down, the size of the Earth, 8,000 miles, it was actually thought that Pluto was 8,000 miles in diameter or bigger. It then got downgraded as being smaller, and then later on, when they had the spacecraft went past it, it then went back up again, but obviously not big enough to classify as a planet. I'm going to start with a first example, planet Uranus, Herschel. Put a question mark, because most people assume 13th of March, 1781, Frederick William Herschel discovered Uranus. 6 years ago, I went to a Society of the History of Astronomy meeting at Chetham's Library in Manchester. And a man that I should have recognised because he's been at Astromeet came up to me and said, "Can I show you something?" And my wife always says, always be suspicious at astronomical conferences of strangers coming up to you and saying, "Can I show you something?" What it was there was an exhibition of stellar atlases at this conference. That's title page from John Flamsteed's 1753 Atlas of the Heavens, which is what we're talking about. The man who came to speak to me was this man, Kevin Kilburn, known to David Sellers and one or two other people, a keen member of Manchester Astronomy Society, and also a founder member, I believe, of the Society of the History of Astronomy. That's him with his telescope. That's a picture of the moon. And on the left, if your eyesight is very good, he's giving a talk about the Forgotten Star Atlas, Bevis's Uranographia Britannica, which is what he wanted to show me. There's a picture of it. Apparently, that book, when it first came out in 1750, I believe it was, never got to be published. I won't tell you the story about why it didn't get published, but it was partly to do with lack of finance and other problems. And there's only a few copies of that book around. And apparently they found a copy a few years ago I think it was in a cupboard, David Sellers will correct me at the end of my talk, a copy of that celestial atlas. And on one of the pages, sorry, that's John Bevis, by the way, the author of this celestial atlas. He's credited in 1731 with discovering the Crab Nebula, which was sort of rediscovered a few years later by Charles Messier and is classified as Messier number 1. It's a bit strange saying he discovered it because it's actually a supernova remnant, and the supernova was actually spotted and observed way back in 1054. So in a sense, he's spotted the remains of it, the Crab Nebula, and it was the Irish astronomer, the Earl of Rosse, who gave it the name the Crab Nebula. So he produced this star atlas with these lovely, wonderful drawings in it. It's called Uranographia Britannica, a British map of the heavens. Came out in 1750. You haven't got the right page there because I tried my best to get the page I wanted to show you, which I think shows the constellation of Taurus, instead of which I'm showing you a page showing you the Great Bear. And if your eyesight is good, you can see the plough quite clearly shown on the tail and the rear end of the Great Bear. On the page which shows, I think, Taurus, the bull, the constellation, Kevin Kilburn pointed out a star to me and he said, "You see that star there?" And I said, "Yes." He said, it's Uranus, 31 years before William Herschel officially discovered it. And it's there in the star atlas, but people didn't know that it was Uranus. So just to finish off the first section about Uranus, coming back to the talk I gave about Pluto, sometimes the information's there, but people don't actually identify it or recognize it for what it is. So there's a lesson there that perhaps sometimes people would discover things a lot sooner if they actually knew what they were looking at. The second example is Neptune, discovered in 1846. Two people get the main credit: the French astronomer Urbain Le Verrier and a German astronomer called Johann Gall. I hope I pronounced his name right. It was discovered on September the 23rd, 1846, as it says there. Verrier looked back on some observations made by Galileo and realized that something that Galileo had thought was a star was actually a planet. Urbain Le Verrier sort of got covered in honors and whatever. There's a gold medal there in the front, showing him in the middle. There's a statue on the left. A similar statue is on the right outside the Paris Observatory. I think it went to Le Verrier's head a little bit because he suggested the name Neptune. And then later on, a few months later, he said, "Oh, it'd be a good idea to call it Planet Verrier." Fortunately, they stuck with Neptune. But there's another guy, an English mathematician called John Couch Adams, a rather strange man in a way. It's thought, I read today, that he probably suffered from Asperger's syndrome. He was a very clever man, but he was a bit shy and he wasn't very good at making contact with people or socializing. And he noted that the irregularities of the motion of Uranus needed to be studied in order to find out whether those irregularities could be attributed to the action of an undiscovered planet beyond it. He then decided it was a planet, which didn't have the name Neptune, of course, then. And what he did was, there's a picture of him here, he got his timing wrong, because it's now recognized that John Couch Adams and Urbain Le Verrier simultaneously discovered Neptune. But what John Couch Adams did was he went to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and this lovely man, Sir George Biddell Airy, who was the astronomer royal at the time, and he went, not 1846, he went there in 1845. Sir George Biddell Airy wasn't there, so he left a letter saying, look, I think there's this planet and I'd like you to get your telescope out and see if you can find it. And Sir George Airy asked for him for a bit more clarification of exactly what he'd worked out, what he was looking for, and he then wrote back, because he didn't get a reply from John Couch Adams, and basically said, I don't have the money and I don't have the right equipment in order to do this, and I don't think it's any part of my job as the Astronomer Royal to be looking for mysterious planets. Just in case this behaviour sounds a bit odd, by the way, a bit of scandal. George Airy had a colleague called William Richardson, a fellow astronomer, famous astronomer. William Richardson, apart from being an astronomer, managed to father 9 children. This is the bad bit. He apparently committed incest with his daughter. A baby was born, and he was accused of murdering the baby. Nobody could find the baby's body, but a workman was digging up the garden of William Richardson's garden, and they found the coffin with the baby in. Amazingly, William Richardson was cleared, and incest, he wasn't tried for that, because in 1845, believe it or not, under English law, incest was not illegal, but murder was. He eventually got cleared, but Sir George Airy decided it was perhaps best if he retired from his job at the Royal Observatory. The reason I've mentioned all that to you is perhaps Sir George Airy felt that he had better things to do than to look for planets that may be there or may not be there. And the book I've got about the Astronomers Royal says, in 1845, Airy notoriously missed an important discovery. Just out of interest, this German astronomer was the first one to actually find it using the telescope at the Berlin Observatory in 1846. So he gets, if you like, joint honours with John Couch Adams and Urban Leverrier as a discoverer of Neptune. He says, this is a letter that he wrote to somebody. He said, "Sir, the planet Neptune, whose position you marked out, actually exists. On the day on which your letter reached me, I found a star of the 8th magnitude, which was not recorded in the excellent star map designed by Dr. Bremiker, containing the 21st hour of the collection published by the Royal Academy of Berlin. The observation of the succeeding day showed it to be the planet of which we were in quest." So there we are, we've got 3 people. But hang on a minute, I found this on the internet. We've now got 4 people. John Couch Adams, Urban Leverrier, Heinrich Derest, and at the bottom left, Johann Gaul. Heinrich Derest was an assistant who helped Johann Gaul with the telescope observation. So he gets kind of joint honours. So you've got 4. If you take Galileo, who had already discovered it but didn't realise it was, you've now got 5. So you've got 5 people sharing the honours for the discovery of Neptune. Who came first? Well, I don't think in this case you can really say, except if you say Galileo. But the ones in the 19th century, which came first of those 4, you can't really say there was a first one at all. Okay. Thirdly, I want to look at pulsars. These are radio waves that come from objects in space. And the person whose name is associated with this is this lady, Jocelyn Bell, with some of her charts on the left, out in the field on the right, and another picture over there with some of the equipment that was put up to actually look for whatever came from space, radio waves. She was doing her PhD then. She discovered it, a first pulsar, in 1967. I thought you'd like this because her professor nicknamed these pulsars Little Green Men. The Daily Mail actually got hold of it, and I can't find the Daily Mail article. who said, oh, there's these people in space who are sending us radio signals. And then they realized it wasn't little green men at all. But the name stuck. And so this advert that I found for a conference, I don't know what year it was, at Greenbank Telescope in West Virginia, calls them exotic stars called pulsars. And the name stuck. So when it came to the Nobel Prize, Anthony Hewish, who was Jocelyn Bell, as she later became Jocelyn Bell Burnell's supervisor, Sir Martin Ryle, who by a strange coincidence, there's loads of tie-ups in my talk, by the way, was also an astronomer royal later on. They got the Nobel Prize, but on the list of discoverers, Anthony Hewish's name came first, Jocelyn Bell's name came second, but she got passed over and she didn't get the Nobel Prize. And Sir Fred Hoyle didn't actually say these words, but he was on a lecture tour in America. And he said, this isn't fair. She should have got it. I remember watching a TV program with Anthony Hewish. Anthony Hewish, by the way, is still alive. He's a grand old man of 96. Sir Martin Ryle died a few years ago. So Anthony Hewish said, oh, well, it's like if a ship discovers something, which brings us back another connection to Columbus at the beginning of my talk. He said, if a ship discovers a new land or something, it's the captain of the ship that gets the honors, not one of the crew. So he didn't think there'd been any injustice at all. Jocelyn Bell Burnell was quite philosophical. This is a lovely quote from her. She said, you can actually do extremely well out of not getting a Nobel Prize. And I've had so many prizes and so many honors and so many awards. Actually, I think I've had far more fun than if I'd got a Nobel Prize, which is a big flash in the pan. You get it, you have a fun week, and it's all over, and nobody gives you anything else after that because they feel they can't match it. But having said that, I thought I'd just be a little bit controversial. There have been lots of controversies about Nobel Prizes. I looked up and the 100 have been awarded. There have been over 600 total Nobel laureates, and out of that, only 19 female scientists have ever won. So it says whether there is a slight hazard. I'm going to look at telescopes. Not what they do or how they're constructed, but who discovered the telescope. The person who normally gets the credit is the guy at the bottom left, the Dutchman Hans Lippershey, who in 1608 applied for a patent in Holland for the telescope. That's his telescope over on the right at the bottom. The other two telescopes, it's the same telescope. I don't know why I put it in. That's the one that Galileo famously looked up at the skies in November 1609 and observed the moon, full moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and one or two other things. So who's the guy at the top left? Before I tell you that, Hans Lippershey, that's a copy of his application for the patent on the left with his signature. And on the right, it tells you quite firmly, Lippershey invents the refracting telescope. In 1608, a Dutch maker invented the refracting telescope, and this caused a revolution, and the device spread rapidly around Europe. And then it says the patent that he applied for was never actually issued, as other spectacle makers claim to have invented the telescope, two of which are named, but I haven't got them in front of me, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Okay, so is it Hans Lippershey who invented the telescope then, or somebody else? Well, Thomas Harriot, who was the one who 4 months before Galileo, in July 1609, used a telescope to make drawings of the moon. And people say he should get the credit for being the first one to make drawings of the moon, not Galileo. I think, and somebody will tell me afterwards if I'm wrong, but when I looked up about Thomas Harriot, a picture of the beloved friend Alan Chapman came up with what I think is a Thomas Harriot telescope. I might be wrong, but just bear with me just for a minute with that. Okay, so if you look at this timeline, you've got Thomas Harriot mentioned, Galileo's mentioned, Kepler's mentioned, poor old Hans Lippershey has disappeared without trace. So, Thomas Harriot then, there's one in the flag for Britain, wonderful. But you can go further back. In the 16th century, Thomas Digges, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, that's Thomas Digges on the left. That's his drawing, a diagram that he did of the Copernican universe. He claimed that his father, Leonard Digges, I think he was called, I think it was Len, he had actually made a telescope, which puts it back about 50 years. And then the famous or the infamous John Dee at the top right with Queen Elizabeth I, famous man. I mentioned Cheetah Library in Manchester, New York. John Dee had close connections, crossovers, whatever. I couldn't find an astronomical chart of John Dee, but I found this peculiar thing on the bottom right because he dabbled in the occult. So there it is with the pentagram and various occult symbols and whatever. It's thought he may have had a telescope or made one. Okay, so we've gone back a little bit. You can go even further. Some people believe that this diagram of Leonardo da Vinci's is a drawing of a telescope, and there's a modern reproduction at the in the middle at the bottom. It's a bit strange. I don't know how the hell you're going to see through it unless you're a midget, or unless you manage to detach it from the wooden base and whatever to look at the sky. But people think that might be a telescope. And you can go back 3 centuries further. Somebody I've spoken about before, Roger Bacon, in the 13th century, Franciscan friar, Dr. Mirabilis, he predicted in 1260 that the magnifying power of a lens could be used as an instrument. And he said, man will be able to study the moon and the stars in great detail. And there's a picture of him there on the left with a telescope. But did he actually ever build one? There's another one on the right. The one on the left, no, sorry, he's not holding a telescope, but the picture on the right, he is holding a telescope. So did he invent this telescope? Perhaps we'll never know. I've only put this picture in, by the way, of Lyman Spitzer, because in 1946, he suggested it would be a good idea to send a telescope up into space. Yes, we have the Hubble Space Telescope. So I thought I'd bung him in, even though he's about 4 centuries too late to be regarded as the inventor of the telescope. I've got this quote in from the book about John Dee. It says, "The history of modern science tends to be portrayed as a series of brilliant ideas that formed more or less spontaneously in the minds of individual men of genius." I apologize for the sexism, but I'm quoting, it's not mine, it's the person, Benjamin Woolley, who wrote the book on John Dee. He says, usually, however, developments emerge far more haphazardly, their full significance remaining in stone for decades or even centuries. This happened with the telescope and its use as an astronomical instrument. So you can see whichever way around you want to put it. I'm not sure which way around it is. There's all people who are doing all the patients over a long period of time, and somebody crosses the line first and their name gets put in the book. So with a telescope, you will find a lot of books that will say Hans Lippershey invented the telescope. I thought, as I'm coming to a close, I'll put this famous quote in from Sir Isaac Newton. He said, if I've seen further than others, it's by standing upon the shoulders of giants. And if you know anything about Isaac Newton, who definitely had touches of autism, he certainly gave credit to people who came before him, but he wasn't very kind about his colleagues or people who were contemporaries. It might be an idea for there actually were people before us who discovered things. It's not just us. And I thought I'd finish off, I'm coming towards the end, with a few things from science which have nothing to do with astronomy, but I just thought it illustrates the point I'm trying to make. First of all, in chemistry, I was told at school Priestley discovered oxygen, Joseph Priestley. Well, he did in 1774, but a Swedish chemist called Carl Wilhelm Scheele actually discovered it in 1773. And I love that thing, Hard Luck, because Isaac Asimov gave Scheele that title because he said the number of things that Scheele discovered, but he always kept getting beaten by other people who sort of took the credit for the discovery, and he sort of gets written out a little bit. Evolution. Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, but Alfred Russel Wallace had also simultaneously come across the mechanism for evolution. You can even go back to the ancient Greeks and find somebody called Anaximander who spoke about evolution within species. DNA, not the discovery of DNA, but the discovery of the double helix, the structure of it. The two people who are named are Francis Crick, who died several years ago, and the American James Watson, who's still alive. But it's pretty clear now that they borrowed, some people say, ideas, who had the misfortune to be a woman at that time. Men tend to take the credit from. She was Jewish as well, so it is suggested there was a touch of anti-Semitism, and she died in when she was 38, and you don't give Nobel Prizes posthumously, so she missed out. And there are others, I'm sure Bill will comment on this, but the two people who invented polio vaccine, both American, Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin. Jonas Salk discovered his in 1955, and Albert Sabin in 1990. Credit, and in their case, they did actually quite at all. But I thought you might like to see, oh, sorry. I've put this in as the sort of just include rules of the game. First of all, get there first, so you get your discovery. Thirdly, and I've already mentioned it with the planets, the information might be there and you just haven't seen it or recognized it. Fourth, good idea to get something published. Wallace and Darwin both published papers, but it was Darwin who brought out a book, and a book takes pride of place over an academic paper. 5, something I've mentioned, it's a good idea to give credit to your colleagues, rivals, and predecessors. 6, does it really matter who got there first? And Maggie came out with this great phrase when I was preparing the talk. She said, perhaps you should talk about people uncovering things rather than discovering things. I thought you might like to see this blue plaque, which is in Cambridge. It's outside the Eagle Pub. And Secret of Life, it says, for decades, the Eagle Pub was the local pub for scientists from the nearby Cavendish Laboratory. It was here on February the 28th, 1980, that Francis Crick and James Watson first announced their discovery of how DNA carries genetic information. I thought that was quite interesting because I imagine them, Francis Crick wasn't known for modesty. I can imagine them coming into the pub and saying, hey, we've discovered the secret of life. And there'll be punters thinking, oh God, we've got a couple of those mad scientists coming in again from Cavendish Laboratory. So to finish off, well, Australia was still there. It just wasn't not discovered. But even that's not true. And I've found this cartoon from an Australian saying, let's not be racist, exchange pleasantries and bid them farewell. What could possibly go wrong? And I thought you'd like this final one of Columbus and the aliens having an argument about who came first, ignoring the fact there's people there already. And so almost exactly 25 minutes. Oh, forgotten this one. This sums up my talk in a way. Jocelyn Bell Burnell, great quote. If we assume that we've arrived, we stop searching, we stop developing. So in one sense, it doesn't always matter who made the first discovery, it's what comes afterwards. And on that note, on exactly, I think, 25 minutes, I'll say, thanks very much for listening.
Okay.
I'll have a drink now.
Just before Dave does go off to have a drink, does anyone have any questions for him?
Well, I have one.
Yeah.
Point really. Harriet, my understanding, I can't remember where I got this from, and it's not on Wikipedia, but he didn't publish anything.
Who was that?
Oh,
Harriet. Yes. Yeah.
He didn't publish anything because he didn't want the publicity. But I heard, or I was under the impression that part of the reason was that he had relatives who were involved in the gunpowder plot, which was only
Yes.
and he wanted to keep his head down.
Yes, that's right.
Is that true?
I think Dave Sellers knows more than I do, but I did read that he was sort of suspected of maybe having sympathies with the gunpowder plotters.
His patron was certainly an associate of members of the gunpowder plot, and so yeah, he did keep his head down.
Yeah,
but it was only shortly before Galileo made his discoveries that Harriet too had turned a telescope to the sky.
Yeah.
One thing I would just take issue with
Dave. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on. Sorry.
I would just take issue with your talking about the discovery of Neptune, because Galler and Darest, who you mentioned at the Berlin Observatory, they were specifically asked to look for it at a certain position by Leverrier. So you can't really say that they are independent discoverers of it.
Sorry,
they really verified Leverrier's prediction, which was approximately, was similar to the position predicted by John Couch Adams as well.
Yeah, sorry, what I meant to say, and I didn't get a chance to say it, I thought I didn't, was that John Couch Adams approached Sir George Biddle Airy to ask to, whatever, and that didn't quite come off. Whereas, as you say, Urban Leverrier contacted Johann, is it Gall? I don't know how you pronounce his name. Yeah, Galler. And he just took it on board, and he went and did it, and he confirmed it. What I was trying to say was, and I'm not making it up, it's what I've read, that George Biddle Airy seemed to have sort of missed out in one sense on that, but he did actually. I read somewhere, and it's in the official history, which I've one of the histories from the Royal Observatory Greenwich about all the astronomers royal, but he didn't see it, George Airy, as part of his remit to be spending time looking for planets. You know what I mean? That's what the book says. I mean, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But
yeah, that is true. But he did persuade Chalice, Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge, to start looking for it with the Northumberland telescope.
Yes, that's right.
But Chalice was hindered by the fact that he didn't have the latest star maps, detailed star maps of that region of the sky that the Berlin Observatory had just received, which you referred to, where you said the 21st hour of right ascension.
Yes.
The latest map of that area of the sky had just arrived, so they were better equipped to discover it than Chalice was.
Thank you. Two things I didn't say, by the way, as well as that, was that John Couch Adams, when George Airy died, he was offered the post of Astronomer Royal, and apparently he preferred the quietness of the academic life in Cambridge. But the funny thing is, when John Couch Adams died, his estate was worth, the money that he had, £32,434, which in today's money is over £3 million. So he didn't do that badly in one sense,
Could I draw this to a close? I'm aware of the time going on.
Sorry.
Thanks very much, Dave.